Hello, and welcome to Staying Strong for Marriages. Thanks for stopping by.
We're going to be looking at 25 different translations of the Matthew 19 passage. It's very critical for people when you start digging a little bit into some of the more technical aspects of why Christians can't decide on the marriage, divorce, remarriage issue. And we're going to see that not all the Greek transcripts are the same, which causes a little extra level of confusion, which could kind of help you understand why people are looking at these different things, because it kind of depends upon which translation they're looking at, or their denomination looks at, or whatever the Westminster Confession used, or if you're Catholic, maybe you're using a different set of scriptures altogether. Not really set of scriptures, but translation work is obviously difficult. Okay, so we're going to go through a number of different websites on Matthew 19. This is from BibleHub.com, and you can see here. So this is the Greek, and this is like the, I don't know what they call it, anglicized Greek, where we're using our letters and trying to get the maybe phonetics right. So this is the pornea term that we talk about a lot, and this is what it would look like in, I guess, ancient Greek, modern Greek. I'm not sure, but thankfully they give it to us as a normal English translation. I say now to you that whoever shall divorce wife of him, except for sexual immorality, and shall marry another, commits adultery, and he who her that is put away marries commits adultery. So the point here is that you'll see this word, and we'll look at it a lot, but it's something like, I don't know, me, maybe, I'm going to call it UN. It kind of looks like a U followed by an N, but maybe I should say ME. I'll go with UN because we're not always going to have this extra line of terms given to us. Sometimes we will, sometimes we won't. So, but here they are in translating that as except. So I'm going to keep a tally, and this seems to say that there is an exception. So if you're married and there's some sexual immorality, that divorce is allowed, or that there seems to be some exception clause here. I'm not going to get into the whole mess of does it also apply to the remarriage part. I'm just going to say that this has like an except for sexual immorality. So I have a category except for sexual immorality, and I'll just put a one tally mark there, and we'll just keep track as we go through. Let's go to the next site. Okay, hey, if I could be so kind as to interrupt myself, I've been kind of thinking about the quality of this video for 6 or 7 days now, and I think it's an important point to add at this juncture of the video that although I will go on to kind of develop this idea that except for, what would that mean? And not for sexual immorality, what would that mean? Possibly they mean two totally different things, right? Except for could mean something like a get out of jail free card, but not for could mean, I say, and we'll look at other people have noticed this as well. The one way to think about it is not even for. So not even if I was cheated on, am I allowed to go on and take a second spouse without getting myself into adultery? Those are two very different. Get out of jail free, and then under no circumstance am I able to take a second spouse while my first one is alive. I didn't want to make it overly simplistic and just kind of like put these two together, but that was kind of what came to my mind. Like, how are we going to take the same exact Greek words, put them in a string, and come out with two different interpretations like we're already starting to see in the early parts of this video. We are going to add on this extra change that was made, and that's going to make it even more difficult. So you may feel quite confused, but this is the stuff that we have to deal with if we want to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of this. Let's keep going looking at some more translations and see how much they vary when they're translated in English, and then we'll kind of tally them up as we go. This one's a little more tricky, a lot more tricky maybe, color-coded. There's like a link, but I forth, moreover, unto ye, to whichever it might have loosed off to a woman, of it, lest, and there's like the UN, lest, upon, and here they say, unto a harlotine, of, and it might have married unto to other it adultereth unto. So I think we can be very happy that when we go to church, that's not how they talk. So that would be very difficult for us. But basically, we have lest, so I'm going to take that like as an except when I categorize it, and here it's harlotine. So I put except for harlotine, And so I'll put 1 there. Here on the site, studybible.info, we have a bunch of literal translations, so we're going to go through those, and we're also going to hit these interlinears. And then there's a lot of lists: modernized King James, early modern Bible. We'll look through some of these. John Wycliffe's, so Bible translator. They have that organization. But let's start with the literal Berean literal Bible. So in this one we have except for sexual immorality. So call that an exception clause. Concordant literal version. Here we'll see something different. Now I'm saying to you that whosoever should be dismissing his wife, so not for prostitution. So this isn't like except for prostitution. This is like not for prostitution. I think in the more modern English, it could be written like not even for prostitution. Certainly that's how some people that read these look at it, so like a negation. And the reason I think that they do that, or they say that they would do that, is there was these 2 groups of competing Pharisees in Jesus' time. One thought it was basically like no fault divorce, you get divorced for whatever reason. The other one said, no, marriage is permanent, except they did think that like a sexual sin could terminate the marriage. And these guys came to Jesus, right? I mean, we know that Pharisees came to Jesus. It says this right here in 3, verse 3. Pharisees came to him, right? And they're asking, can we do this for every cause or what, right? And so given the controversy that everyone was clearly aware of, especially Jesus, since he was a rabbi, he was a professional teacher, right? He would have been very aware of the debate that was going on between these 2 groups. He would have inserted, not for prostitution, right? So not for fornication, which would have like gone right to the heart of one of the questions, the key standing points of one of the groups. So this would be like very strong, like not even for prostitution is a marriage like ended. Of course, you have to decide, but emphatic diaglot New Testament. Here we have an except for fornication here. So it's another one of those. It's 3 of those. This is the God-be New Testament in red. And so here we have a similar thing, like not for fornication. Not for fornication. So now there's 2 of those. Next, we're going to go look at Green's literal translation. If not for fornication. So what does this mean? Whoever else shall put away his wife, if not for fornication. Okay, so that would be like an exception. And there is some interesting debate about this if word, but obviously you can see if not for fornication would kind of, I think to most people say, it would be this synonymous with like an exception. But if you drop the if and you go back to what God came up with, it reads totally different. Whoever may send away his wife not for fornication and marry another commits adultery. So that if is it really turns on whether or not that if is there. And so definitely we've come across theologians and people that work on this issue, and they've traced back, well, when did the if come into everything? We'll get to that in a second. I don't want to do too much commentary here. We're just doing tallies. But I say unto you that whoever shall put away his wife not for fornication, so this is a new one, John Nelson Darby. 2 for not for prostitution, and now this one says not for fornication. Julia Smith translation. I feel like there's possibly people that, like me, have never heard of some of these translations, so it's really sort of interesting. Okay, here we have an except for fornication, like we typically find with most Protestant churches or I said most Protestant churches. They tend to find an exception for fornication. This one's really interesting because it's the modern literal, and I don't know if it was the website or what weird thing is going on here, but it's not even there. Whoever divorces his wife not over, and it just like is blank, and just goes on to verse 10, so it doesn't even give us the critical information that we're really looking for. Okay. We got two more in this category. Then we'll move on to some interlinear. Okay. Saving for unfaithfulness. So I'm going to say that that means essentially the same as except for fornication, unfaithfulness, except. So I'm going to put that in the except for sexual immorality category. Although I don't know. I mean, does it mean not for unfaithfulness? It's hard to say. You can see the difficulty of translation work. So here we have an if statement, but it's not for fornication. It's if not for whoredom. So we've seen that once before. Now we've seen it twice. So I'm going to say this is like except for whoredom. So if your spouse or a spouse was involved in prostitution, then that would be an exception clause. Otherwise, a person would need to stay married. I think that's fair, but obviously people debate this at almost every angle. Here's another one, except for whoredom. So it's 3 for that category. Really reminds me of, what is her name? Sharon Henry? Yeah. Has really try to make a case for the all the parts that relate to prostitution. And so we're seeing some of that here. You can see that. So here's actually the same EI. We're going to be finding this earlier, but you'll see, they then there and those Pharisees came to him, trying him and saying to him, if it is permitted for a man to divorce the woman of him for every cause. So you can see that EI is if. And so that's a big thing that people noticed was added at some point around 14 or 1500 in a lot of Protestant translations that wasn't necessarily there before. And so people said, well, how did this come into this record that we have? Let's go down to 9. And I say to you that who ever may divorce that woman of him, not for fornication. And so here there's no if and there's no, it just reads, I take him to mean he's saying to that group of Pharisees that thought fornication was a reason, he's saying to them, not for fornication, not even for fornication. So the Berean Greek Bible is also all in Greek, but let's see, here's the UN, sometimes translated as lest or except, but there's no EI before that, so there's no if. So, which may not seem like a big deal, but some people make it to be a big deal. So I'm just pointing it out as we go through this, so that you have some kind of frame of reference when people do begin to make a deal about it in the future, when we look at other content or other writers. What else do we have here? A little hard to read with all the parentheses, but I say now to you that whoever shall divorce wife of him, except, so here's the UN, they call it except for this, they call it sexual immorality. So I'm going to tally that up as except for sexual immorality is found in the Berean Interlinear Bible. Here we have it. Here's the EI right here. Let's see if I can, yeah. The EI, this new if not for fornication. So you could see especially here that you take this if out, and I would kind of categorize it as just like a not for fornication. I'm talking to those, Jesus is talking to those group of Pharisees that thought fornication was a reason. But if you put the if in there, it changes it. It changes it. You can hear it in your mind. This and this and this and this. If not for this other thing, then yada, 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 right? On and on and on. The if changes it. The if definitely changes it. So this is why the EI makes it important. So with the EI in there, I'm going to say that that's basically the same thing as except. If it was just written except for fornication, it would provide an exception for people. Here's a Greek one. There's no if on this one before the UN. So that's Nestle. So Byzantine Greek, I remember that there was in a previous video from Leslie McFall, something about a Byzantine translation, I believe. A Greek majority text and a Byzantine translation. And I can't remember the details, but I do remember that those came up. So what do we have here? These are all Greek words, but here again, no if before the UN. So again, I can't help you a lot more than that, but I think that's okay because not all of us are going to be Greek scholars. It's not like being a Greek scholar should be required to be a Christian. We have the Holy Spirit to help us, to lead us into all truth, to be our great counselor, that Romans 12 says that we can know the will of God. So that's why I tried to say earlier that even though this is a little bit, is technical for sure, and maybe we're going to get out of it what we can get out of it. This one doesn't have the EI before the UN. We're going to get out of it what we can get out of it, and at least we can say to ourselves, well, we've familiarized ourselves with some of these Greek texts, and we've seen that there is some variation. So here you find the EI on this one. See it? See it there? Yeah, it's there. It's not always in there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Scrivener's Textus Receptus. And it's hard for me to know when these what they're referring to as far as ancient scrolls, what year these scrolls were discovered, because you do have this issue. It seems like it's identified that there was a change in the Protestant translations, or there's a change by a Catholic writer named Desiderius Erasmus, and his change had something to do with his parents, and that the change that he made was really picked up by the reformers. He put in like an exception clause is what it seems I've read. But obviously there's been a lot of scrolls discovered. There was some discovered, in the 20th century? Here's the EI again. It wasn't in the last one. It's in this one. So there was the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the 20th century. I mean, what were translators to do in the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s? Like, they didn't have all of the text that we have today. So maybe that's why we have all kinds of different translations that say different things, because of archaeology, essentially. What was available to everybody wasn't always the same. And so maybe the translations have gotten better in recent times, or perhaps they've gotten worse. I'm not sure I'm in the right. Yeah, I'm in the right verse. So no EI this time. And I'm gonna I guess do the rest of this list. Thanks for hanging with me. It's not like the most thrilling, fun work. Like, I don't know that I'm getting tons out, but this one, no EI here. And again, the EI translates to essentially like if in English, which seems to very much change the meaning of the sentence in how I've been reading it in this video, and kind of how others tend to read it. Another one, no if statement here. This is from the Byzantine manuscripts, F35. I mean, if that means something to you, that's great. For most of us, it probably doesn't mean much. There is one other interesting category. So they have Chinese, and there's other versions. It really occurred to me, like, what if your people or your language only has one translation of the Bible? I mean, we have the blessing or the difficulty, depending on how you want to see it, of all these different translations that we have available in English. So this one's not for fornication, so that would be like one where there is no exception. That's the conservative version. But yeah, like, what if there was only one version available to you? Here's one that's except for fornication. So that'd be like the more standard fare at your typical American Protestant church, that if there was any sexual misdeeds done, that the marriages could be over. Is over, I guess, if a person wanted to press charges, so to speak. That's how they usually describe it. Don't have to. You could be gracious, but that's how it's usually understood. Okay, here's one that's interesting, and this one is hard to put into a category. Where would you put this? that whoever puts away his wife, unless for lewdness, would that be like the same as not for lewdness, or except for lewdness? In my ear, it seems more like except for lewdness. So let's say it's an except, and now it's kind of a new category. I'm going to say it's like except. It's going to be like except for lewdness, because I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not exactly. It's a bit of an unclear construction in English. Charles Thomas. So let's look at a few more. Except to be for whoredom. Okay, so there's an exception, and it's not for just any old fornication. It's for, I'm going to put that next to except for harlotry. So, if I didn't mention it before, I had to remake this video. There's a glitch, but I think I mentioned maybe in this video already that Sharon Henry, does a lot of work trying to press the point on the harlotry point, which would be huge. If there was just adultery in your family, it would matter a lot, right? Versus someone either selling themselves into prostitution for, a side hustle, or visiting prostitutes. It's a totally different type of thing. And so, versus something like this, where it's just except for a general immorality. Not going to try to solve everything for us here. I'm just trying to point out why there is some confusion among Christians, and if we can get down to the text and just look at it in bite-sized pieces, we might be able to kind of have a better understanding like how we got here. Except to be for fornication, so I'll do one more of those. It's 11 that fall into that category out of the ones that we've looked at. And I think I stopped here last time I made this. Except to be for adultery. So here we have the English Jubilee, and what do we have? Except to be for fornication. Okay, there's one more of those. And that was obviously done in 2000, so maybe they had access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but who knows if they used them, or who knows if they relied on something else. I mean, it's sort of tricky to know. But her unfaithfulness. So I'd put that in the same category as just except for sexual immorality. Doesn't have anything to do with prostitution or harlotry. So out of 25, we have 15 that are just would say something like except for sexual immorality, something a general sexual sin, and with an exception. So 15 out of 25, that's 60% would fall into that category. So that's going to be like the lion's share, the biggest proportion. You have 4 that would say like you're married unless there's some kind of involvement with prostitutes. So there's 4 out of 25 there. So what was that? Like 16%. And then there's 1, it's like unless for lewdness, and so that'd be 4%. And so, like, not usually what we see lewdness being used. What that means is that there's 5 left over for ones that basically seem to say, like, not even for this stuff does a marriage end. And so we have 3 that just say not for fornication, and then we have 2 that say not for prostitution. So even in there, if you just break it down into those 5 on one side and 20 on the other side, it means that like basically 80% of the ones that we looked at give some type of exception, and then 20% say like no, the more hardline or stricter view, or whatever you want to call it, more permanent view of no, there's really no, not even for these other reasons, I guess you could say. Of course, there's subcategories in each of those. Like I said, there was 2 for not for prostitution, and then 3 not for fornication. So then you have to get into the trouble of what do those words really mean. Excuse me. Prostitution, I think, is pretty clearer. Fornication, some people debate about whether fornication is a term for me. unmarried people. So typically, maybe a more specific word for sleeping around inside of a marriage would be adultery, right? So, but we saw a lot of these things called not for fornication. My guess is that all of these would use porneia, which is the general term, and then the translators are forced to kind of define it specifically or leave it more general. Okay, so what does that mean? Where does that leave us and what did we gain? Well, at least we looked at 25 different versions and we realized that there is apparently some kind of EI, some kind of if statement that we can find in some translations, but it's not always there. So that does give some credence to some of the Leslie McFall work and probably other people that have looked at this EI insertion done by apparently Desiderius Erasmus between 1500, I can't remember exactly when he lived down to the exact year, and certainly when he did his translation work. But it was during that time frame. The story goes that it was picked up by the Reformers, and then it was pretty far on down the line before scholars, really figured out that there was this kind of split, that this new word came in at some point, and they were able to trace it back. But at that point, a lot of different Bibles apparently had been translated using that if statement or that if clause put in there. So maybe that's why Protestant churches, primarily in my experience, I don't know about your experience, but seem to be way more on board with if there's any kind of sexual sin, that the marriage is over and people can go on about their business. And we saw that, about 60% of the time. There was some interesting stuff talked about harlotry. I've never been around any church or heard any sermon recently that would say the marriage is good unless there's prostitution involved. I've really never, ever heard anyone talk about that. And yet we find that pretty often what was it? Prostitution was mentioned in 6 out of 25 times, or 24% of the time. It does definitely come up, and something that might not come up regularly in conversation. I think because there are 5 passages, so 20% of what we looked at today, that seems to say that there's no if, there's no except. It just seems to be speaking to that, like we talked about before, that ongoing Pharisaical controversy and debate going on at the time, that is just going to say, not for fornication, not for prostitution. I'm thinking, and other people, when they write about it, they say that means that there's Jesus is talking about not even for these things. So that marriage is really robust and it's able to endure through a sexual sin, even prostitution, depending upon which of these translations you want to look at. That leaves us kind of still in a sticky point, because most of us do not have time. I mean, God bless you for watching this. It's not that exciting. It's a lot of the same repetition, and we don't really feel like we're getting a huge consensus view necessarily. There is enough discrepancy here that we're still a little bit left wanting, if you're like me, and it does kind of leave the door open for some of these other people to say there's no exception in Matthew 19. I think that 20% of the time is high enough numbers that people could say that. I mean, it seems like they could say, look at all these transcripts that we have. These have to be considered. You can't just throw out 20% of transcripts. That's not correct. Now, it would be really great if we had ones like a chronological list that was just prior to Desiderius Erasmus. That might help. But other people have done work by just looking at the simple work of early church fathers. You can find that. Stephen Wilcox does a great video of that, if you find that in our playlist, or find his website or Google him. He does a nice job of summarizing what a lot of the early church fathers said, and the argument for being in favor of what they had to say in their opinion on the things was that they were very close in language capability to what the New Testament writers would have had, way more than any of our friends who just came out of seminary, right? They're not even close to having that same level of Greek capacity, right? You'd want those people that were there in the culture, knew the lingo, just like we were talking about here. What's the difference between not for fornication as compared to not even for fornication? Not even for fornication is extremely clear in modern American English. Not for fornication is a little bit wishy-washy. It's more, if you want to be more exact, you'd put that even in there. So that's the kind of point why some people say, well, you can, really drill down on this textual analysis and try to go to Dead Sea Scrolls and trace back the Desiderius Erasmus change and go try to find transcripts before him and see what they say and do all this back and forth. Or some people could say, or you could just go look up the early church fathers and just go, you could just go straight to kind of the source in that sense. It's not that easy of an issue. You could see why the controversy persists and why the average person, especially like people, single parents, they would not have time for this kind of research. I feel fortunate to be able to do it, and I kind of find it something that matches well with my personality. So I hope that's helped. Thanks for looking into this with me. We'll keep researching, and we'll keep praying. I always like to pray for families, so I'll just do that here in closing. Father, definitely want to ask for your help. Pray for myself and my friends. And so I just pray that you would speak to us. We know that, Jesus, you said that, your sheep know your voice, and the voice of another they're not going to listen to. So just pray that you would help us, Holy Spirit, discern these things. We'll continue to learn. We thank you so much for helping us endure during difficulties. And we pray that you keep families together, help keep us, renewing us, keeping us holy, growing us in righteousness, protect us from the evil one, help us put on the armor of God, help us know what to do. Thanks for Romans 12 and the promise that we can know your will and good, pleasing, and perfect will. So bless you. Pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, guys. Bye.